Hello, welcome to PM Express Corporate Wednesday. My name is Stephen Enti. Now, the global economic activity has slowed significantly in recent months, weighed down by policy uncertainty. Despite these difficult global conditions, growth in sub-Saharan Africa has remained largely on track. However, the region's economic prospects are vulnerable to heightened downside risk. Because Africa's growth recovery since 2000, the longest expansion since independence, was based on improved macroeconomic policies and political stability, the prospect of sustained growth are strong. Now, this is just a summary of the Africa's Pulse, the October version, October 2012 version. That's the summary of the Africa Pulse, which had contributions from the World Bank chief economist for the African region, Shanta Devarajan, who is my guest on PM Express. We're talking to him about the forecast for Africa's growth, and then we'll narrow down to Ghana's performance on the scale of the Africa region and the rest of the world. So, Shanta, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
So, Africa, doing well or not doing so well?
Oh, Africa's doing well. Growth for the past year, 2012, was a little under 5%. And if you leave out South Africa, which is the largest economy but growing much more slowly, Africa's growth is over 6%, which makes Africa the fastest growing region in the world. If you exclude China from Asia.
So when we compare that growth to what's happening in the rest of the world due to the recession, Europe's recession, and the global trend in general, is this sustainable?
I think it is sustainable because most of Africa's growth, including in Ghana, has been driven by commodity prices. And despite the uncertainties in Europe, in the United States, commodity prices have stayed at an all-time high, and the forecasts are they're going to remain quite high. Now, there's still quite a lot of uncertainty around that. I mean, for instance, if there's a major recession in Europe, much more severe than the one they're going through now, or there's a crisis in the United States, a fiscal crisis, or China has a very hard landing, that could then lead to a collapse in commodity prices, like the one we saw in 2008-9, and then Africa's growth prospects would be much worse.
Now, you mentioned I read a summary of the Africa Pulse of 2012. There is a recent version. You just brought my attention to it. But let me read that thing again. You said that despite these difficult global conditions, growth in sub-Saharan Africa has remained largely on track. However, the region's economic prospects are vulnerable to heightened downside risks. What are these risks?
Well, those risks are, as I was mentioning earlier, a major economic crisis in the Europe, particularly the Eurozone. Indeed, we've done some simulations or sort of stress tests of Africa's growth prospects. And for instance, if there is a crisis of the type where, say, two countries in the Eurozone are completely excluded from global capital markets, I mean, that's a major crisis. The growth projection that we just had would be decreased by 1 percentage point. So instead of growing at 5%, Africa would grow at 4%.
Is this something that policymakers, economists, and perhaps the general citizens should worry about, these risks?
Well, they have to worry about it, but unfortunately, those risks they can't do much about. That depends on what policymakers in Europe and the United States and China and Japan are doing. I think what citizens in this country, as well as in other African countries, and policymakers can do, is to make sure the macroeconomic policy framework is one that is robust to these shocks. See, if countries are following prudent macroeconomic policies, then they're able to weather some of these shocks, because for the most part, they don't have much control over what happens to those economies.
Let's talk about Ghana. You've spent a few days here in Ghana. What are your impressions of Ghana so far, general impressions?
Well, I think my general impression is that Ghana is doing quite well. Growth has been quite high over the last 3 or 4 years, including, I think, last year or a year before, Ghana was the fastest growing country in the world, but that was due to a one-shot increase in investment and the oil production coming on stream. And I think Ghana has demonstrated an ability not only to grow rapidly, but to reduce poverty. Ghana was the first country in Africa to reach the Millennium Development Goal of a 50% decrease in poverty. That said, I think there are some problems and risks facing the Ghanaian economy that need to be addressed. Certainly, the fact that the fiscal deficit is 12% of GDP is a huge concern. But I'm confident that since it's accepted that it's a concern by everybody, the policymakers themselves, that they will be able to address it. Don't forget that the fiscal deficit in 2008 was 14% of GDP, and through a concerted plan, the policymakers in Ghana were able to bring that down to about 6%. So it can be done. And so I'm confident that it will be done. But there are other challenges for Ghana to sustain this growth. Most visibly is the problem with infrastructure. This country, we've had power cuts and water cuts just in Accra, including in this hotel. And that needs to be addressed quite quickly because the demand for infrastructure, given this rapid growth, is only going to increase.
Ghana has been the darling of the World Bank for several years through the structural adjustment programs and other economic policies that many critics of the World Bank said were kind of shoved down the neck of Ghana. What is the relationship of between Ghana and the World Bank, considering looking at the history Ghana has had with the World Bank over the years?
Well, let's separate a few things. I mean, one is Ghana has been the darling not just of the World Bank, but of the international community, not because of the policies, but the fact that it has shown results. The fact that Ghana has been able to grow at 5, 6, 7% a year, the fact that poverty has been declining at a fairly rapid clip, the fact that the financial system seems to be relatively robust, are all results that Ghana has shown. Now, there's a question of whether these were as a result of policies that were, as you said, shoved down their throat. I'm not even sure I would accept that, because when I think back at the policy program that was implemented in 1983, way back, you know, as a result of to correct for the hyperinflation and the huge black market premium. That program was designed here in Accra by Kwesi Bachwe, Joe Abbey, Gobin Nankani. These were all Ghanaians, distinguished Ghanaian economists who actually wrote that program together. Now, it is true that that program was very close to what the World Bank would have designed or the IMF would have designed, but that doesn't take away from the fact that this was genuinely owned in the country.
Now that Ghana is growing, lower middle income, is the relationship between the World Bank and the country going to change? I mean, my understanding is that the World Bank is scaling down. Is that correct?
No. When a country moves from being low income to a middle income country, the only thing that changes is the fact that as a middle income country, the economy would have access to more instruments, capital market instruments. In particular, it has access to the non-concessional arm of the World Bank, which is IBRD lending, the way that Brazil and Argentina and Indonesia do. So Ghana will become eligible for that, but there's a period of transition. And during that transition, the World Bank continues to provide the concessional finance, which Ghana gets today. And that will be part of the transition. It will move from concessional to non-concessional. But I just want to add, the one thing that will not change and will probably accelerate is our knowledge relationship with Ghana. I mean, the World Bank does a lot of work with Ghanaian economists as well as for the government and for the people of Ghana. The kind of studies we do, the analysis we do, the kind of things that we do in the Africa's Pulse, that will only continue and it'll probably be intensified.
One of the most sensitive things that have come up lately is the debate over whether to remove subsidies on fuel or keep them? I mean, government projects that if it is to maintain these subsidies, then it could be spending in excess of over 2 billion Ghana cedis just to support or subsidize fuel. What is the World Bank's, from your perspective as a chief economist, what indications are you picking as to whether this is good for the economy or bad for the economy?
Well, we did a study. In fact, the previous issue of Africa's Pulse was dedicated to the issue of energy subsidies around Africa, including Ghana. And in that study, what we found was that the bulk, the lion's share of energy subsidies, fuel subsidies, accrue to the non-poor, and in particular to the rich, because for the simple reason that they spend a bigger portion of their income on gasoline and electricity and other energy-related products. The only one where the poor spend more is kerosene. So a subsidy, a general energy subsidy, will actually accrue much more to the non-poor than the poor. In fact, I think it's something like 60% of that subsidy goes to the richest quintile of the population, the richest 20%, and it's very much lower than 10% goes to the poorest quintile. So that's the fact. That's what we have observed. Now, that said, it's still a question that the removal of a subsidy is as you said, a political decision, because it has an effect both on the rich and on the poor. The fact is that if energy prices were to rise by 20% overnight, it will affect the well-being of the poor, but it will also affect the well-being of the rich.
It will also affect businesses, which are depending on capital to work.
So I think any program to consider removing subsidies should be accompanied by a program to protect the poor and the most vulnerable in society. And that is possible to be done. There are other countries like Indonesia, Brazil, that have done that.
What modules would you want Ghana to be taking a look at, perhaps, to introduce into the economy as the thought of subsidies come in?
Well, Indonesia would be a good example. Indonesia had a huge array of fuel subsidies that even led to Indonesia, which is an oil producer, being a net importer of oil because they were consuming so much of the oil products. But when they when they removed the subsidies, they introduced a cash transfer program targeted towards the poor. So the bottom quintile of the population received cash in return with which they could use to pay for the fuel that was now at higher prices.
Let's shift our focus a bit to the broader Africa region. When we look at Nigeria, we look at Cote d'Ivoire, the instabilities in Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria's own instabilities due to terrorism and other challenges that it has. What is the outlook for Africa in the light of all of these?
The outlook for Africa as a whole is still quite positive, but we can't ignore these problems of fragility. I think in addition to Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire, the one that is most apparent today is Mali, which is undergoing quite a bit of turmoil, although it might be coming to a close soon. And so we are all faced with major risks. But the point is, what is the underlying cause of some of these instabilities? And that has had to do with the dispersion of income and the dispersion of welfare between two regions in a country. In Mali, it was very clear. You had the Tuareg in the north, who were much less well off than the southern part of the country. In Nigeria, too, there's a divide between northern Nigeria and southern Nigeria. And the root causes of the conflict in Cote d'Ivoire, which lasted for about 10 years, was another north-south divide. So I think the way we look at it is that there are threats and there are sources of fragility in African economies. But if we can address those root causes, we might be able to minimize the risk by, in particular, emphasizing that the people in one part of the country who have been neglected or whose incomes haven't been growing as fast as the other part could actually need more attention and more focus in order to make sure that they also benefit from society's growth.
A country like Nigeria perhaps comparable to Ghana's energy challenges as well. You mentioned in your interaction with the media yesterday that African countries need to be thinking about working together to resolve their energy problems. How exactly should that be done?
Well, Nigeria's energy problems are maybe somewhat unique to Nigeria because it's such a big oil exporter, and yet the infrastructure for delivering oil products is still very weak. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is what I mentioned yesterday, is that West Africa in particular is made up of a large number of very small countries, countries like Togo, Benin. I mean, Ghana is actually one of the bigger countries in West Africa, which means that these countries cannot make use of the economies of scale by having their own energy production. So they need to collaborate, such as what we have with the West Africa Power Pool, where the group of countries associated with West Africa could benefit from the same source of energy. And let me add one other thing which we haven't talked about is transport infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right? If we can get that Lagos to Abidjan road, there's been a long-standing project to have a functioning highway between Lagos and Abidjan. Think of what that could do for commerce along the coast, from every city, from Abidjan to Accra to Lomé to Cotonou to Lagos. You could have a major metropolis, a West African metropolis that's connected, that's a source of commerce, that's a source of growth and poverty reduction in their sub-region.
And in terms of electricity generation, same approach?
The same approach, absolutely. You need to collaborate because the production of electricity becomes much cheaper as the size of your market grows. But to do that, and that's the difficult thing, countries need to harmonize their policies. They need to have the same regulation for energy use in Burkina Faso, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Togo, and Benin. And that's a bit difficult because in order to have the same regulatory policy and, say, the same tariffs, you're giving up some sovereignty. The country has to say, we're no longer controlling the price of electricity in Ghana. We're going to be part of the West African Power Pool, which will then determine the price of electricity. And that's why this has taken a while, but I think we're making progress.
We're making progress. My name is Stephen Anti, and my guest on PM Express Corporate Wednesday is Shanta Devrajan, who is the World Bank Chief Economist for the African region. We'll take a short break, and we'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to PM Express. My name is Stephen Anti, and Shanta Devrajan is my guest. So, Shanta, let's talk about how resource-dependent African economies are. I mean, I'm picking this theme directly from the Africa Pulse. Tell us how resource-dependent African economies are.
Oh, yeah, African economies are, by and large, resource-dependent. There's some that are heavily resource dependent in the sense that they get about 90% of their revenues from oil or some other mineral, such as Nigeria and so on. Ghana is actually not that far along yet. But the other aspect that we've observed among our oil-producing countries in particular, the traditional oil exporters like Angola, Gabon, Nigeria, and so on, is that the outcomes in terms of poverty reduction and human development have been very, very disappointing.
Yeah.
So you have a country like Gabon, which is a oil producer, a per capita income of $10,000 per year. And it has the lowest or second lowest child immunization rate in Africa. So it has fewer children in Gabon, a smaller percentage of children are immunized relative to poor countries like Togo. So something is going on there with the oil money that is making it difficult for these countries to actually achieve some of the goals of poverty reduction. And I think one of the features is that oil money, as opposed to other revenues, go directly from the oil company to the government without passing through the citizens. And as a result, citizens, on the one hand, may not know how much oil revenue there are.
And is this good or bad?
And that's the point. It's not good, and which is why I would congratulate the country of Ghana for having introduced this petroleum revenue bill, which is a way for citizens to be informed about the oil revenues, because without that, there would be no way for them to be informed.
So transparency is key.
Transparency is key, but it has to go alongside transparency. Has to go accountability. So not only are the citizens informed, but then they need to scrutinize to make sure the government actually spends the money in their own interests, in the people's interests, and that's what the follow-on to the petroleum revenue bill has to be.
When we look at the pressures on Ghana's currency, for example, and the fact that Ghana's growth has been seen as jobless, with a huge chunk of graduates graduating from universities with no jobs. These indicators, are they really something that you, as a chief economist for the African region, see and think that still, regardless of that, Ghana is pretty much on a good course?
Well, we should look at the indicators more carefully as well. Here's a fact. Private wage employment in Ghana is growing at about 9% a year, which is a very fast rate of growth. It's faster than GDP growth, right? So there are jobs being created in the private sector for these university graduates and so on. The trouble is that's from such a low base that it isn't enough to absorb all the large number of young people entering the labor force. But even the university graduates represent a tiny, tiny fraction of the labor force. The fact is that the majority of the labor force in Ghana,
agrarian,
are working either in farms, family farms, or in the informal sector off farms, the household enterprises, the people selling vegetables on the street or doing sewing and things like that. Now, that's 80% of the labor force. These people are not unemployed. They're actually working. They're working very hard because they can't afford to be unemployed. But they're earning so little that their productivity is very, very low. So I see the employment challenge, including the youth employment challenge, as one of increasing the productivity of that 80% of the labor force that's in the informal sector. Now, the governments around Africa, not just here, seem to be focused much more on that formal sector and the unemployed university graduates. I think in Ghana you even have a unemployed graduates association. Right? And I think it's important that those people get jobs. But keep in mind that that's only a tiny fraction, and they are considerably wealthier than the ones who are in the informal sector. Because the fact that they were able to go to university and the fact that they can afford to be unemployed means that they're at a certain level of income relative to the informal sector. So I think the big challenge, and I'd like to see even more emphasis being put on raising the productivity of those working in family farms and household enterprises.
So what programs and policies is the World Bank putting in or working with Ghana to ensure that these challenges you've identified are resolved?
Oh, well, a lot of our programs are focused on that. For instance, we have an agricultural productivity program precisely to get at this issue, including one that is providing irrigation in the north. That's one way. Irrigation can increase the productivity of farms fivefold. It can quintuple the yields. The other is programs to provide finance and training to these people working in the informal sector. In fact, we did a very interesting study where we provided bookkeeping training to young entrepreneurs in Ghana. And what we found was that just that one thing, that bookkeeping training, enabled them to get more credit, which then increased their profitability and their returns.
So beyond that, what other projects is the World Bank working on with Ghana with the aim of helping Ghana improve its economy and deal with some of the challenges it's facing?
Well, we have a range of programs, all of which are Government of Ghana programs that we support. So the agricultural productivity is one. There's a large program on environmental sustainability, and there are programs on energy as well as water. And there's in fact, I visited one when I was here, the gas pipeline that comes all the way from Nigeria through Togo to Ghana. That's partially financed by the World Bank. And then we have a very interesting program to improve the customs and port performance that involves both infrastructure, but also involves changing business licensing so that and computerization so that the customs can be more efficient.
Now, in your interaction last night with, there was a very important question which came from one of the contributors from the Google office about the delicate balance between working to manage inflation and then working to enhance infrastructural development. I mean, various governments, when they have been in power, have taken one arm of it. How do you think, as a country, our governments should be balancing this, how should the governments be towing this delicate balance?
Well, the key is balance, because the two extremes are not sustainable. Right. We know, and Ghana unfortunately has had the experience of hyperinflation. So if you let the inflation rate go above, say, 50%, then it spirals into hundreds of percent. On the other hand, too much contraction is also not good because it undermines growth. So there's a sweet spot between, say, 20% and 3% inflation that most countries try to hit. On the other, and that's what Ghana is trying to do. But on the other hand, in terms of growth, what matters is not simply the size of the deficit, although that is important. But when it's within some reasonable limits, what matters is the quality of that investment, that these are investments that are actually productive, that they're actually generating growth, such as infrastructure or agricultural investment, rather than just simply a deficit that's based on consumption or on unproductive investments. And around Africa, we have no shortage of those that could actually neither deliver growth nor reduction in inflation.
Let's talk about the wage bill on government, Ghana. The government has been under pressure lately from various groups, labor groups. The doctors recently threatened to go on strike if their concerns with the single spine salary structure is not resolved. Graduate teachers have also done the same. It appears that consistently those who are employed by government agencies are putting constant pressure on government to increase their wages. These calls and these demands, are they reasonable from where you stand?
I haven't looked at it closely enough to make a judgment on that. All I would say is that the government has two main functions. One is to provide public goods, such as education and health and infrastructure. And the other is to make sure that the poor are protected, the vulnerable in society are protected. And the role of civil servants has to be to make sure that those two functions of government are delivered. And so in any discussion about the wage bill, it has to be connected to how productive is the civil service in achieving those goals. One thing we find in other countries, I haven't done the work in Ghana, is that teachers, for instance, who are, you mentioned, are among those who
graduate teachers
who might be lobbying for higher pay, are also absent from the classroom about 25% of the time. This is the figure in Tanzania and
this
Uganda.
Is realistic in Ghana, right? As well.
So then I wonder, what does it mean to pay these teachers more if they're absent 25% of the time? Maybe we should change the way they're paid. Maybe if they don't show up in class, their pay gets reduced, which is what it is in the private sector. That might then improve the productivity of these teachers, and then they could be eligible for higher pay.
So you really do not think that the demands for higher pay per se are problematic, but if government decides to meet these demands, and it means that it has to put in money, it has to make sure that the productivity and quality of product services that are provided by these people match these investments.
Yeah, I mean, I can't make a judgment on the particular demands here in Ghana, but I would say in general the principle has to be that wages, any wage demand should be tied to productivity.
Let's talk about corruption. How bad is corruption in Africa?
Well, all the indicators are that Africa has the highest levels of corruption, say the Transparency International and other indicators seem to show that. That said, I think some countries have managed to reduce it so that the trend is definitely positive. And we have some countries like Rwanda and Ethiopia where corruption has actually come down quite a bit and is relatively low.
And what worked for these countries?
A combination of features. I think leadership, clear signals from the leadership that corruption will not be tolerated, and a program of accountability from below. And one of the things that we find is that when citizens have more knowledge and information about what services they are due, then they scrutinize the public servants to make sure that there's less corruption. And let me add that this teacher absenteeism we talked about earlier, or doctor absenteeism, that's a form of what we call quiet corruption. It doesn't get the scandals of the large amounts of money shifting hands, but it could actually affect the poor a lot more.
And government should be dealing with these things. Now, when we look at the structure of our economy largely, and the fact that majority of those that are employed in the agricultural sector, are employed in the agri sector, it makes agri very key. I mean, I want you to tell us from the World Bank's perspective whether you think that there are specific programs that has worked for Ghana to reduce poverty targeting the agricultural sector. Because I know this is an interesting area for you.
Well, probably the program that did the most for reducing poverty in agriculture was the reform of cocoa prices that happened in the 1990s. It's very clear that once the terms of trade shifted, once farmers got a decent price for cocoa, they actually invested in cocoa production, and yields and productivity shot up, and now there's been a significant improvement in the lives of poor farmers in Ghana. So pricing and taxation, or the absence of taxation, can make a huge difference. And associated with that was macroeconomic stability. I mean, if you remember the old days, when the exchange rate was overvalued, and so there was a lot of macroeconomic instability. That was when the farmers were actually getting very low prices for their products.
And you haven't detected any corrupt practices in the agricultural sector which is hampering efforts?
I haven't looked into it, so I don't know. But I would say that the other is that governments around Africa, around the world for that matter, try to help the agricultural sector by providing subsidies such as fertilizer and other inputs. And sometimes the corruption is in the delivery of those inputs, which again means that it's a self-defeating proposition, that the very people you're trying to help are the ones who are not receiving the benefit of the fertilizer. I just remember that in Tanzania they introduced a fertilizer voucher so that farmers could go out and buy fertilizer. But it turns out that the local governments decided they were going to allocate the vouchers, and they allocated it to their political constituents.
Their own cronies and friends. So let's shift the discussion a bit to infrastructural expansion. When you have you been to Ghana apart from this visit? You've been to Ghana a couple of times.
Oh, yeah.
When you look back to the first time you came and now, what are your observations with infrastructural expansion?
Well, it's very interesting because I think I first came here in the early 1990s to Accra, and I don't remember the traffic being what it was, what it is now. I was shocked, actually. I mean, you leave like 10 minutes to go to a meeting, right? And now it takes you hours. But to me, that's a sign of progress rather than a regress, right? Because it means that now the economy has grown so much that there are many more cars on the street. There's much more business activity, and so now we're seeing traffic jams. So now is where the infrastructure constraint is starting to bind, and we need to work on that. But I think it's a good problem to have because it means that you're doing something right. I don't think we want to go back to the days when there was no traffic, but this was still a very low-performing economy.
All right. When you look at governments in Ghana over the years, whether it is NDC or NPP, do you see continuity in their policies and projects?
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, the one feature about Ghana that I've noticed since the early 1990s, I guess since the first multi-party election, which is what, 91 or 92?
92?
Since then, the progress on structural reforms, things like the banking sector, the financial sector, trade reform, business licensing, and so on, has been steady, despite the fact that the party in power has changed. So there's been absolutely a firm progress on the policy. And today, Ghana actually has some of the best policies among low-income countries in Africa. Now, macroeconomic policy, though, tends to have this cycle. Every 4 years, the deficit seems to grow, 2008 and 2012. So while they're making progress on the microeconomic front, I think they may need to do something about reducing the amplitude of the cycle on the macroeconomic front.
The projects which the World Bank supports in Ghana, whatever sector it is, how are you able to ensure that in these programs and projects there is accountability?
All right. There are two ways. Every project that the World Bank does has what's called a Project Development Objective, PDO, which we list what we expect this project to be delivering. And then every 6 months or every year, a team comes in and monitors how well we're doing relative to those objectives. And those objectives are the criteria by which the project is evaluated at the end of the day, and the project manager is evaluated as to how well they did relative to those objectives. So that's one way of accountability in terms of objectives. The other accountability is that the spending has to be followed by certain rules about procurement and financial management. So there are certain procedures that have to be followed. So it's like an audit as to whether the money that was spent for the purposes for which it was intended. And we have a whole team of financial management experts and procurement experts that are monitoring that. So there's accountability both on the input side and on the output side.
Well, I'm speaking to Shanta Devrajan, the World Bank Chief Economist for Africa region. We'll take a short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to PM Express Corporate Wednesday. So, Shanta, let's talk about dependence on aid. African countries in general have depended on aid to a very large extent. Almost half of Ghana's budget is donor supported. Is this a good sign that these countries are growing? Can they ever be dependent?
The fact is that the dependence on aid is declining quite rapidly. It used to be about 4 times what it is today. It was like, I think it's about 2% of GDP now is aid, 2.5% or something like that. For these fast-growing countries like Ghana, Kenya, and others on the continent. So just as a feature, the dependence on aid has declined quite substantially over the last couple of years. And that's a sign both that countries are relying more on other forms of investment, both domestic as well as foreign investment, as well as improving their macroeconomic policies so that they can grow faster.
You can grow faster and
the
become
denominator is also becoming larger, and the numerator is becoming a smaller share of total investment. I mean, today, private capital flows to Africa are larger than foreign aid. It's over $50 billion. So I think that the era of dependence is
gradually dwindling, or is fastly disappearing.
It's rapidly disappearing in some countries. There are some countries that still rely, because those countries don't have access to capital markets, still rely much more on aid. But those are the very, very small, very poor, typically fragile states.
What about unfair trade? What's the situation of unfair trade currently from the World Bank's understanding or perspective of trade imbalances between Africa and the developed economies?
The World Bank's position, and certainly my position, is that some of the policies pursued by the European Union, for instance, and to some extent the Americans, which involves subsidizing agricultural products and commodities, makes it harder for African countries to compete. But the fact is that's a political decision made by voters in Europe and the United States. There's not much we can do to change that. So they'll change it, and they will change it. I mean, I can't imagine that it's going to
You wouldn't
sustain.
want to also discuss specifics like the economic partnership agreement.
Well, but I think given that these programs are inefficient, these subsidizing agricultural exports in the EU are inefficient, I still think there's a lot that African countries can do to improve their export potential. And most of those are what we call behind the border, including trade facilitation. Yeah, I was just at the port visiting this project, and they were showing me this computerized system where they attach it to the truck so to make sure that the truck driver can't deviate from the route, and they can monitor whether he deviates. And the idea is to make it easier for that truck to move to the border of Burkina Faso or wherever. But then I asked, well, but what about roadblocks? And they said, unfortunately, we haven't been able to reduce those roadblocks. There still are roadblocks, some of which are informal, some of which, unfortunately, are even formal in the sense that they are local governments and local militia or local police that are imposing them. So there are lots of things we do inside our countries that block our ability to trade. And we have to work on those. Because, as I said, you can talk about unfair trade all you want. The Europeans are going to decide on
what's good
subsidies.
for them.
Well, yeah,
you have to look
when it's
inward.
when it's politically feasible for them. But we can do a lot here to do the best possible with trade, given what's happening with Western nations.
Now, Africa is seen to be on a growth trajectory where a lot of focus is on economic expansion, creating jobs. In the midst of all of these is press freedom and the ability of African countries to encourage viable media. What in particular is the World Bank's recommendation on improving media freedoms and efficiency of media work in Africa in general?
Well, that's not an area that we actually work on. The World Bank is a development agency. We certainly talk to the media and encourage the media, as we are doing right now, because I think the media is extraordinarily powerful as a means of empowering poor people with information, so that they can then bring pressure to bear on the political system. I think that's what's going to make the difference in development. But we do also recognize that in many countries, probably not Ghana, but in many countries, the media lack capacity, particularly on economic issues and things like that. So we have training programs for journalists, for instance, across Africa, that we try to say, when we do a report and we present it, it's one thing to give it to do the report, and also, it's one thing to do a press release, but what I want is for media, people like yourself, to scrutinize a report and be able to write about it from your perspective, not from
and have a better understanding to pass on to the audience.
And we've been exploring even ways of accelerating that. I mean, for instance, when we launch a database, and we have a database called African Development Indicators that has about 2,000 indicators across the continent. We'd like to be able to equip journalists to be able to write a story out of that database almost on a weekly or a monthly basis. So it's not just the splash we make with the launch of the database, but it's a continuous process where that information, the data that are contained in that database, are then made accessible to the public on a regular basis.
Let's use the last 10 minutes to do an overall forecast of what 2013, and perhaps in the short term, the next 2 or 3 years, is going to look like for Africa. Well, what's the forecast like?
The forecast is that growth will remain or will be around 5 to 6%, just because the uncertainty that was mentioned in the report, the Africa's Pulse of last October, some of that has reduced.
Okay.
The fiscal cliff in the United States that everyone was afraid of seems to have they seem to have walked away from the fiscal cliff. And the Eurozone, there's a little bit of cautious optimism that the worst of the crisis may have been overcome. So I think the prospects are reasonably good. And by the way, China also, there was some concern that China was going to go into a hard landing, and that's certainly not happened. In fact, China's growth has picked up a bit. So I think we're, in terms of the global economy, we're optimistic, and the forecast for commodity prices are to remain high. Now, I think there are major risks internally, such as the crisis in Mali and northern Nigeria and so on, because they have the potential for spreading. And that's something that we worry about. I mean, if you think about the fact that Tuaregs live everywhere from Niger to Mauritania, then a crisis like this it's very hard to contain it in one country. And there's also developments in Democratic Republic of Congo, that particularly the eastern part, that could get worse. The border between Sudan and South Sudan remains to be a source of some unrest. So we have some internal concerns. There are some big elections coming up this year that we are hopeful will take place in a peaceful way. One, most notably Kenya, which is in a few weeks.
Well, Ghana's elections is also before the Supreme Court because the opposition has petitioned. So the outcomes could have an impact on the overall horizon.
Well, we know that, for instance, in 2007, the elections in Kenya led to violence and conflict, which in turn really undermined the economic performance and uncertainty. You know, the tourism revenues fell, and there was uncertainty in investment fell, and so these can be very costly. In fact, if you look at Kenya's history, there's always a dip around election time. So I think I'm hopeful that as a result of the new constitution and some of the work that's been done in Kenya, that this time it'll be much more smooth.
So what about the World Bank's relationship with Africa in general? I mean, in the medium term, what's it going to look like?
I think our relationship is going to mature quite a bit because Africa is maturing. You know, Africa is going through a major growth and poverty reduction phase. And so the kind of relationship, the things that Africans are asking us for are somewhat different. It's not about money. It's about advice. It's about support that will then be catalytic to bring together the different forces in the economy, and also support at the regional level so that you bring African countries together so Africa can trade with Africa, Africa can feed Africa more vigorously than it currently is doing. So I'm very excited about the future. I think this relationship is exactly along the lines that we would want. And it's becoming very similar to kind of relationship we have with, say, India or China or Brazil.
So you would say in 2013 and in the medium term, it looks bright for Africa.
That's right. The medium-term prospects are bright. And let me say, the main reason I say that is that when I look at how far Africans have come over the last 15 years, this growth over the last 15 years was not an accident. It was due to the hard work of policy reform that brought the macroeconomic policies to a point where Africa could benefit from high commodity prices. If they can do that, I'm confident that they can overcome some of the structural problems that are stopping them from going even further. And that's why I'm optimistic.
Shanta Devrajan, it's great to have you on the show. And,
thank you very much.
We've enjoyed spending time with you. We do hope that you enjoy the rest of your stay in Ghana.
Thanks very much.
My name is Stephen Anti, and it's been great having you on PM Express Corporate Wednesday. Good evening.